Imagine this. You're walking down a quiet, empty street just after midnight. The streetlights flicker slightly in the wind. Ahead, you notice a man kneeling over another figure on the pavement. At first glance, it seems like someone helping another who's hurt. But as you move closer, you see the red smears on the ground, the metallic glint of a blade. The man looks up. He sees you, and then he smiles. The instinctive reaction is horror, disgust, perhaps fear. But what if the most terrifying part isn't that you saw evil, but that you recognized it? Not in the man, but somewhere deeper, somewhere within yourself. We like to think of evil as other, a foreign force, a mutation in the moral DNA of a few monstrous individuals. It's cleaner that way. We can explain away the Hitlers, the serial killers, the sadistic warlords. They're not like us. They're broken. They belong in another category of human being, if they're human at all. But what if they are like us? What if the line between good and evil isn't drawn between people, but through every human heart? This is the uncomfortable truth we avoid. The darkness within us all. Carl Jung warned of this inner confrontation. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. And yet, most of us spend our lives turning away from our own shadows. We build myths around our goodness. We curate our identities through moral performance, our causes, our outrage, our virtuous posts online. We treat morality like a brand. But deep down, we know that darkness lives in us. Not just the capacity to lie, cheat, or betray, but to dehumanize, to hate, to inflict pain, and to enjoy it. These aren't foreign concepts we learned from villains in history books. They're ancient instincts. Consider the simple act of revenge. We celebrate it in fiction because it resonates with something primal. The satisfaction of an eye for an eye. The craving for justice twisted into punishment. We don't just want to correct wrongs, we want the wrongdoer to suffer. Now imagine that instinct unfiltered by culture or consequence. Imagine it amplified by power, fear, or the need to belong. That's when ordinary people commit atrocities. During the Rwandan genocide, neighbors turned on neighbors. School teachers helped slaughter children. Why? Not because they were psychopaths, but because fear, resentment, propaganda, and collective rage opened the floodgates of their suppressed instincts. And once the boundaries collapsed, evil wasn't an anomaly, it was a contagion. Philosopher Hannah Arendt famously coined the phrase "the banality of evil" after covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi bureaucrat. He didn't look like a monster, he didn't speak like one. He was, in her words, terrifyingly ordinary. A man who organized mass murder from a desk, not out of sadism, but out of a sense of duty and blind obedience. He never thought deeply about what he was doing, and that, Arendt argued, is what makes evil so chilling. It often wears the face of bureaucratic normality. This isn't to excuse evil, but it is to complicate it. And complexity makes us uncomfortable. Because if evil is not just out there, but also in here, then we are forced to confront a frightening possibility. Under the right circumstances, we are not so different from the people we fear or despise. We carry within us the seeds of unimaginable harm, resentments that could curdle into cruelty, fears that could justify violence, loyalties that could rationalize barbarism. We don't have to act on these impulses for them to exist. They are part of us. And unless we learn to see them, to name them, to wrestle with them, they control us from the shadows. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster, warned Friedrich Nietzsche. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. The mirror is waiting. We live among masks, not just the social smiles or the polite nods at strangers, not just the filtered photos or the curated personas we present to the world. The masks are much older, deeper, rooted in our psyche like armor forged in childhood, and they serve a darker purpose than we dare admit. We wear them not to deceive others, but to deceive ourselves. Every civilization builds myths to protect its people from the horror of who they truly are. We tell ourselves we are civilized, moral, enlightened. We uphold laws, create codes of ethics, glorify compassion. We believe we've risen above savagery, that the ancient fires of tribalism, vengeance, and bloodlust have been extinguished by reason. But they haven't. They've just been disguised. We celebrate our heroes, soldiers, martyrs, revolutionaries, but often ignore the shadow they cast. Every noble cause has its casualties. Every flag waved has covered violence. And every war, no matter how justified, feeds on the same human instincts: aggression, dominance, survival through the defeat of another. What we call virtue is often just violence with a socially acceptable face. We like to think the worst atrocities are committed by monsters, but history shows otherwise. They are committed by people with families, routines, dreams, people like us. And more disturbingly, they are often committed not in defiance of morality, but in the name of it. This is the paradox we find hardest to confront. Evil often believes it is good. The Inquisition tortured and burned in the name of God. Nazi Germany believed it was purifying the world. The Rwandan killers believed they were defending their people. In each case, the perpetrators weren't laughing villains, they were convinced. They believed they were doing the right thing. That belief is the most dangerous mask of all. We all carry within us a fragile need to feel righteous. It gives us stability, identity, and moral clarity. But righteousness, when left unexamined, can become a narcotic. It dulls empathy, turns disagreement into heresy. It makes it easy to dehumanize others, to label them evil, broken, or less than, and in doing so, justifies cruelty. Even now, in our modern world, we see this dynamic in the way we discuss those we oppose, politically, socially, ideologically. We don't just debate ideas anymore. We cancel, expose, destroy. We flatten people into caricatures and reduce nuance to slogans. All in the name of justice. But is it always justice? Or is it another mask? Psychiatrist M. Scott Peck, who studied the psychology of evil, wrote, "The evil are utterly dedicated to preserving their self-image of perfection. That is the most chilling kind of evil, not the violent outburst, but the smooth, relentless denial of responsibility. The refusal to see one's own faults. The need to be always right. We all know someone like that. Sometimes we are that someone." Arthur Schopenhauer once said, "Compassion is the basis of morality. But compassion is not possible when we are obsessed with our own moral image. When our self-concept depends on being one of the good ones, we lose the ability to admit when we're wrong. We deny our darker urges. We silence our capacity for cruelty. But repressing evil does not eliminate it. It gives it power. Just as a shadow grows longer in the setting sun, the more we deny the parts of ourselves that are capable of harm, the more they grow in the dark. Unseen, unacknowledged, and eventually unleashed on others and on ourselves. So we continue to wear our masks, smiling, outraged, virtuous, safe behind the illusion that evil lives in others, never in us. But deep down, we know the truth, that there are parts of us we're afraid to face, thoughts we bury, urges we rationalize, lies we tell ourselves to maintain the illusion, and the longer we wear the mask, the harder it becomes to take off. The next time you judge someone harshly, ask yourself, what part of you are you trying to avoid seeing? Because maybe that's where the real danger lives. A child isn't born cruel, but neither is a child born innocent in the way we often imagine, untainted, angelic, free of darkness. Instead, a child is born raw, a bundle of instincts, need, fear, hunger, rage. The seed of humanity is there, but it's unshaped, untrained, deeply vulnerable. And it's in this vulnerability, this earliest soil, that cruelty takes root. Cruelty is not the result of pure malice. It rarely begins with the intention to harm for harm's sake. Rather, it grows from the twisted alchemy of pain, unmet needs, rejection, humiliation, and fear. It begins when the world teaches us that love must be earned, that power protects, and that to be weak is to be crushed. Cruelty is a scar-turned weapon. Many of the cruelest people in history, dictators, tyrants, serial abusers, were once children who felt powerless, who were brutalized by those they depended on, who grew up in homes where violence was routine, where affection was conditional, where identity was denied or mocked. They learned early that being vulnerable meant being broken, and so they made a vow, often unspoken: never again. Never to feel that helpless. Never to be beneath anyone. Never to let someone else hold the knife. That vow hardens into a shell, and within that shell, cruelty finds purpose. Cruelty becomes a way to reassert control in a world that once stripped them of it. It becomes a twisted mirror of justice. They will feel what I once felt. They will know how deep the pain goes. They will not forget me. In this sense, cruelty is often rooted in pain, not pleasure. But over time, if unexamined, it can become pleasurable, because it offers power, and power feels like safety to the wounded ego. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, observed this in the camps. He saw guards, ordinary men, exert unspeakable cruelty over others, not always because they hated their victims, but because it gave them control, validation, a perverse sense of meaning. Frankl wrote, "A man who becomes conscious of the responsibility he bears toward a human being will never be able to throw away his life. He knows the why for his existence and will be able to bear almost any how. But those who lose their why often seek identity and dominance. And from this existential vacuum, cruelty is born. The most dangerous people aren't always those who feel hatred, but those who feel nothing and need something, anything, to feel real. Cruelty is seductive. It offers a shortcut to significance. If I can make someone suffer, then I matter. If I can instill fear, then I am not invisible. If I can hurt, then I exist." This isn't just about dictators or killers. This impulse lives in everyday life. The child who bullies to feel important. The lover who emotionally manipulates to avoid abandonment. The manager who humiliates to assert superiority. These acts may be subtle, but they all carry the same DNA, a wound weaponized. Most chilling of all, cruelty doesn't always feel cruel to the one inflicting it. Can feel justified, rational, even necessary. We may tell ourselves, they deserved it. They needed to learn a lesson. They pushed me too far. I was just protecting myself. And sometimes that's true. But more often, it's our pain speaking through the language of dominance. It's the shadow seeking release through control. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, "Hell is other people." But he didn't mean that people are inherently evil. He meant that our perception of others, especially when they reflect parts of ourselves we dislike, can become unbearable. And when we cannot face our own vulnerability, we often take it out on those who do. Cruelty is born in this refusal to sit with our own pain. In our rush to discard it, we transfer it. We break others to avoid feeling broken. Until we face our wounds, until we give them voice and meaning, we risk becoming the very thing we once feared. There is a peculiar intoxication in being certain. Not just confident or assured, but morally certain. It's the kind of certainty that doesn't waver when confronted with doubt. It doesn't entertain nuance or hesitation. It knows, and it knows with the full force of righteousness behind it. This certainty is seductive because it relieves us of a terrible burden: ambiguity. To live in a world of gray is exhausting. To wrestle constantly with competing values, to question one's motives, to consider the humanity of one's enemies. It takes effort, humility, and courage. But moral certainty spares us that. It makes the world simple again. Us versus them. Good versus evil. The saved versus the damned. And that's precisely when evil thrives. History is drenched in blood spilled by the morally certain. The inquisitors burning heretics, believing they were saving souls. The terrorists bombing civilians, convinced they're fighting for divine justice. The colonizers enslaving nations, claiming to bring civilization and light. In every case, they acted not despite their morality, but because of it. Once we believe our cause is unquestionably just, anything done in its name becomes acceptable, even necessary. The end sanctifies the means. Collateral damage becomes unfortunate but unavoidable. And soon we stop seeing people only obstacles. Aldous Huxley saw this danger clearly. The surest way to work up a crusade in favor of some good cause is to promise people they will have a chance of maltreating someone. To be able to destroy with good conscience. This is the height of psychological luxury. There's a thrill in feeling righteous. It electrifies the spine, steadies the hand, quiets the inner critic. When we are morally certain, we are gods in our own minds, wielding punishment not out of hatred but justice. And because we believe we are right, we rarely look back to see what we've become. This can happen to anyone, on any side. It happens in political discourse, when compromise is replaced by contempt. It happens in activism, when movements once born from love and justice turn to purges and purity tests. It happens in religion, when faith becomes a hammer, not a haven. What begins in the name of morality becomes a machinery of control, exclusion, and ultimately violence. It's easy to spot this dynamic in others, but far harder to spot it in ourselves. When was the last time you knew you were right and steamrolled someone in your certainty? When was the last time you dismissed someone not because of their actions, but because of their identity, their group, their label? We've all done it. We do it online, in traffic, at the dinner table, sometimes with a sneer, sometimes with a shrug. And each time we feel something quietly gratifying. We were the better one, the smarter one, the righter one. But the more we indulge that gratification, the further we drift from compassion, and the closer we creep to cruelty. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin warned that one of the greatest dangers of humanity lies in the pursuit of final solutions to moral problems. Because final solutions have no room for disagreement, no room for mercy, no room for error. But to be human is to err, and to forgive, to doubt, to question, to hesitate is a form of moral bravery. The uncomfortable truth is this: moral certainty is a breeding ground for human evil because it feels so clean, so noble, so good. It cloaks vengeance in justice. It hides insecurity behind righteousness. It replaces complexity with slogans and flattens human beings into enemies. The antidote is not moral indifference, but moral humility. To say, I believe in right and wrong, but I could be wrong about what is right. That is a rare and difficult stance, but it's the only stance that resists the seduction. Because when we stop questioning ourselves, we stop being human and start becoming something far more dangerous. They were nurses, shopkeepers, farmers, fathers. They played with their children, cooked meals for their families, prayed, laughed, and cried. And then, one day, they rounded up neighbors, friends, and colleagues, led them to pits, locked them in buildings, lit the matches, pulled the triggers. They were not monsters. They were ordinary people who became instruments of atrocity. We like to believe we would never do such things, that in the face of moral catastrophe, we would resist, speak out, save the innocent. But this belief is mostly fantasy. It's a story we tell ourselves to preserve our moral identity, just as they once did. The truth is this: most evil in history was not done by sociopaths. It was done by people who followed orders, who adapted to the norms of their group, who wanted to belong, who feared punishment, or who simply didn't want to rock the boat. In 1961, social psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment that changed the way we understand human behavior. Participants were told to administer increasingly severe electric shocks to another person for every wrong answer they gave. The victim wasn't real, but the participants didn't know that. They believed they were inflicting genuine pain, even as the victim screamed in agony or fell silent. A staggering 65% of participants went all the way, administering what they believed was a potentially lethal shock, just because a man in a lab coat told them to. They weren't evil. They were obedient. Milgram wrote, "Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs, can become agents in a terrible destructive process. This is how evil becomes bureaucratic, efficient, normal." The Nazi regime didn't need legions of sadists to run concentration camps. It needed clerks, conductors, guards, people who could stamp documents, coordinate schedules, manage logistics, people who wouldn't ask questions, people who would just do what they were told. And most did, not because they hated, but because they were afraid to stand alone, because they were loyal, because they were ambitious, because they told themselves it wasn't their responsibility. But beneath all these justifications lies something more disturbing: the human capacity to dehumanize. To kill another person, you first must unsee them as a person. That's what propaganda is for. That's what euphemisms are for. Final solution, collateral damage, enhanced interrogation. Language becomes the anesthesia for the conscience. Once someone is no longer human in your eyes, almost anything becomes permissible. This isn't a relic of the past. It's alive in us. You see it in tribal politics, in online harassment mobs, in workplace cultures that tolerate bullying, in racial, religious, or ideological scapegoating. We reduce others to labels and strip away their complexity until cruelty becomes not just acceptable but necessary. We may not wield machetes or rifles, but we wound with words, with silence, with our refusal to see. The scariest thing about evil is not how rare it is, but how mundane it can become. And it happens fast. A crisis arises. Fear spreads. Groups divide. Leaders offer safety in exchange for obedience. Dissenters are cast out. And the good people, the ordinary people, stay quiet, or worse, comply, because it's easier to conform than to confront. It's easier to tell yourself you're just doing your job. It's easier to rationalize than to rebel. As Carl Jung wrote, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, because when we do, we begin to realize that we, too, are capable of falling. Not just hypothetically, but really, subtly, slowly. It doesn't take horns or hatred to become a monster. It takes pressure, fear, a longing to belong, and a refusal to look in the mirror when it matters most. If we want to resist evil, not just in others but in ourselves, we must learn to recognize it in its smallest, most ordinary forms. Because that's where it always begins. It's easy to point fingers at history, at tyrants, dictators, and executioners, at the fanatics and the cowards, the soldiers who fired, the officials who signed the orders, the citizens who stayed silent. What's harder, what's almost unbearable, is pointing that finger inward. Because the final battlefield is not in courtrooms or war zones. It is inside us, in the quiet places we avoid, in the unspoken thoughts we pretend aren't there, in the choices we make when no one is watching. This is where the reckoning begins. We've built a world where we are trained to appear good, where moral signaling has replaced moral reflection, where apology is performance, outrage is currency, and humility is weakness. We are addicted to being seen as virtuous, but terrified of facing the parts of ourselves that are not. But real goodness requires more than image. It requires a brutal honesty, a descent into our own depths, to ask, where does my cruelty live? When have I enjoyed the pain of others? Whom have I dehumanized in my thoughts, my words, my indifference? These questions hurt. They strip away the flattering illusions. They demand that we confront the potential for evil that lives inside us, not because we've committed atrocities, but because we are human, and no human is exempt. But in that confrontation lies the only true hope. The goal is not to become perfect. It is to become conscious, to recognize the shadow, not to repress it, to see the ugliness, not to be consumed by it, but to integrate it, to bring light not by denying darkness, but by naming it. This is what Carl Jung called shadow work, the lifelong task of identifying the disowned, disavowed parts of ourselves and drawing them into awareness. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. If we do not examine our darkness, it will lead us quietly, relentlessly into destruction, not always in the form of grand crimes, but in the slow erosion of empathy, in the small betrayals, the gossip, the coldness, the looking away. Evil doesn't need to roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it smiles, sometimes it rationalizes. But awareness changes everything. It allows us to choose differently, to pause before we lash out, to soften before we judge, to question the righteous voice in our head that demands punishment or exclusion, to ask every day, am I seeing this person as fully human, or as a symbol of something I hate in myself? It allows us to develop a new kind of courage, not the loud kind, but the quiet, difficult courage to live in moral uncertainty, to say, I don't know everything, I might be wrong, I want to understand, create space for redemption, not just for others but for ourselves. Because once we admit that evil is part of us, we can no longer draw a clean line between the good people and the bad. We stop measuring worth by moral purity and start seeking integrity. We stop demanding perfection from others and start cultivating humility within. And from this soil, dark, messy, honest, something else grows. Not virtue in the shallow sense, but something deeper: responsibility, accountability, compassion that isn't performative, but hard-earned, and perhaps even love. Not the sentimental kind, but the fierce love that comes from knowing just how broken we all are. The love that sees clearly and chooses anyway. There is no final cure for human evil. No utopia, no ideology, no purity that can erase it. But there is a path, and it begins not in the world, but in the mirror. The reckoning within is not a punishment. It is an invitation to stop pretending, to stop performing, to finally become real.